Hello, today we're going to be painting with watercolors, and we were studying the Romantic period in history, and we were looking at J.M.W. Turner, and today we're going to be trying to replicate this watercolor painting of his. And but first, before we get started on that, we wanted to talk about a few techniques, just some watercolor techniques, and the supplies that you'll need. Watercolor paper. You're going to want it turned to the side that has just a little bit of bumps on it, and not the grid-like pattern on the back. And your watercolors, we're just using Crayola ones because this is a tutorial for elementary school art class, homeschool co-op. And I have 2 jars of water here. One is going to be a jar for rinsing your dirty brush in, and the other one is for when you need to add some water to your paper or to your paints and you want clean water. So we have a dirty water jar and a clean water jar. You also need some paper towels and a pencil. We want to use our kneaded eraser today. If you don't have that and you just have a regular eraser, that'll work fine too. And then I have some different size brushes, but you might just have the one that comes with your set. That's fine too. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about just a few techniques quickly before we start our painting. So one of the techniques that you can use is to get watercolor working. We're using like a tray of watercolors here. So they're dry pigment, and then you add water to it to get it to move around and work. So we're going to just pick a color. We're going to do red. So I'm going to put some water in the red and mix it around. I'll get a little bit more until I have a nice, starting to move around in there. So the first technique is just called wet on dry, excuse me, where you put the wet paint onto the dry paper, and it just goes on like that. Okay, and it'll soak into the paper. Okay, I'm gonna rinse my brush off. And the next technique is called wet on wet. And the next technique is used for whenever you're wanting to have colors blend together really well. Watercolor is really great for this because the colors can bleed into each other and create a sort of, that's a great way to make skies look like there's no hard edges. So to do that, you just dip in your clean water and put some water on your paper where you want it to have that effect. Just enough that the paper's wet, but you don't want to see puddles on there. If you have puddles, you can use your paper towel and dab up a little bit if you have a lot of water pooling on there. And then you're going to take your paintbrush and get water into your watercolor. If you pick a different color if you want. This is just an example. This isn't, you guys are just going to watch this. You're not doing this yet in the class. Just follow along. So I just dabbed it on there in one area. See how it's sort of bleeding as it goes? Now if I want to put a different color, let's do purple. Near that, they'll start to bleed in together like that. And you can just let it do its work. It works together like that, or you can use your brush to make it blend more, whatever you feel like. And then you just let it dry. And you can layer these techniques where if you were to do this first and then you can let it dry and then do this technique over the top of it. And we're going to actually do that in our painting today. There are other techniques you can do too, where we'll do one more here. There are a lot of different techniques, but these are just the ones we're going to be using today in our project. So if I take, say, some blue again, and then I want it to be a little bit drier so that there's almost no paint on the brush, and I can just, it's even too much, scrape it on there so you see the color of the texture of the paper coming through. There, that's better. Do you see how the texture of the paper is coming through? So we might be able to use this today too if we have time to get to that. So these are just a few of the techniques. This was dry on wet, or wet on dry, excuse me, wet on wet, and this is kind of a dry on dry in a way. Okay. Okay, now moving on to our project. Paper here. It's always recommended to start by taping your paper down, because as you do watercolor, as the paper soaks up the water, it starts to curl up the edges. So we're gonna tape this paper down. Let me check which side I'm on. That's the right side. You call me out upon the waters. Okay, the next thing is we're gonna look at our picture here. And before you start painting, a lot of artists like to go ahead and put in any details in pencil lightly to kind of know where your, areas are that you're going to be painting. So in this painting, this is the horizon line is right here. The sky is up here, obviously, and down here is the water. This is a steamboat on the ocean. It's Steamboat in the Storm, I believe it's called. So here's the boat that's headed into the rain showers coming down here in the big storm cloud, and then the rough ocean here. So we're gonna just do just a couple details here. So I'm gonna set my picture right here. I'm gonna use my ruler. I'm gonna go ahead and draw. I'm just gonna eyeball it. It's near the bottom here, where the bottom of where the horizon line is going to be. Okay, there's my ocean line there, the horizon line. And then I'm just gonna freehand in this boat here. So it comes up like this, and it's very stylistic. It's not realism, remember, guys. So you can draw it however you want to make it look. It's got some bumps on the top for all the things that are on the boat. And it looks like the front of the boat is up just a little bit as it's going through the waves. And then there's just a hint of a smokestack here, it looks like. And then I'm not going to draw in the steam coming off of there, because we'll do that with our paint afterwards. So I'm just going to leave that to be kind of freely done. Oh, I realized I forgot. You're supposed to dab this on this before you get it wet to take off any graphite that might be built up there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to start with the sky. And this is the wet on wet technique we were talking about. So I'm going to get clean water here. And I'm just going to put some water on my paper all the way across. So you guys can do this too with me. Okay, and then it looks like the sky has a little tiny bit of yellow in it. So I'm going to use this part of my tray to mix colors in. I'm going to clean my brush off, get some clean water, and there's a little bit of pink in there in the sky back here I'm looking at. So I just want a little bit though, not much. Mix that in. See how it's making it a little murkier, kind of an orangey color. And then it looks like it might be even a tiny bit brown in there. So I'm going to put just a little bit of brown in that color. And I'm going to start putting that on here. And you kind of work fast with watercolors because they dry. And it's not going to do the blending that you want. It looks like there might be just a tiny bit more. Oops, I double dipped. Don't do that. So I'm just trying to work quickly here. This is just the underneath layer. I'm just kind of putting it in there, and it turns. See the colors changing in the picture here, how it's blending down. Okay, now I'm going to start going in with a little bit of the blues. This blue is very vibrant, like very bright looking, and these colors are pretty muted. So I'm going to add a little bit of black to it to gray it down some. Black is a strong color though. You don't need much because it'll. So that's still popping a lot, so I'm going to put a little bit more. There that's starting to look better. And I'm going to, and then you can just kind of dab it here and there as you go. Some of this technique here is that when we did the scraping thing at the end in our technique, we were doing dry and dry. If we have time at the end to let our painting dry and try to scrape some of that on there, we will. So, oops, wrong one. So if I want this to blend a little bit more, I can just go in with some water and dab along the edges like that to start to make it blend into the background. It looks like there needs to be a little bit more purple and red in mine. So just go ahead and start going in and put on the background as you see in your painting, using the colors that match.
When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours. You are mine.
Okay, my paper's starting to dry out a little bit on the bottom here. So to get the rain shower part where it's raining, I'm going to add a little bit more water here. See if we can get it to do what we want. And then I'm just going to pull some of this down. I'm not even re-dipping. I'm dry my brush off. To make it look like it's got streaks down like that. This blue I put right on here is popping a little bit, so I'm gonna take some of that off. And then down below here, there's a line of the ocean that's a little bit darker. I'm gonna go ahead and try that with a dry technique before I blend the bottom of the ocean. So it's a little bit darker, bluish black here. And it's starting to bleed up, if you notice that. So I'm gonna take my paper towel and I'm gonna dab right on along that edge to try to get it to stay down there because it was too wet above it. So the nice thing about watercolor is you can move it around a lot, and with a paper towel you can dry off parts if it's not doing what you want. So I'm just dabbing. Don't scrub or it'll rip up the paper. Okay, then there's a little purple. More purple in here. And then it looks to me like the rest of the ocean is a wet on wet down here, so I'm going to add water underneath like this and just kind of let it blend on its own. I'm kind of doing side to side strokes this time to make it almost look kind of like faint waves in there. But it's your painting, so you can make it however you want. Okay, now the next thing is I'm gonna use a hair dryer to dry this so that we can put the boat in there with the steam.
Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me.
Okay, when you're done drying, if you want to check, you can use the back of your hand to see if it feels cool. If it's cool, it might still be a little wet. If it feels room temperature, then it should be fine to do your dry, wet on dry, and have it not bleed. So mine felt like it was pretty dry right where I wanted to paint, except right here. I added a tiny bit more yellow in there, which was probably a no-no because it's not, when you do the wet on wet behind there and then you mess with it later, if you don't let it completely dry before you do that, you start getting these little watermark lines, but that's okay. We're just trying to do a little quick example here. So the boat to me looks like it's a little bit brownish black. So I'm gonna start a new color over here in my paint tray. And then I'm gonna just follow my pencil lines. I'm painting along the top of the edge of the boat. And I'm using a smaller brush now. If you have just one size brush, that's fine. But if you have a smaller brush, I recommend using that. And I'm just pulling down the paint. I'm going side to side. I'm gonna get it a little bit darker for some interest here and there. And then I'm gonna get just a tiny bit of water on the bottom here to pull it down. Like that. And then the smokestack here. It doesn't look like it kind of doesn't touch it there. And then there's just a few puffs of steam coming up and curling around into the air. So I'm going to do just a couple little dabs. To do that. So if the paper underneath had been wet, those little dabs would have bled out in every direction, but we wanted them to kind of stay where they were. So like that. Now, you can paint in layers with watercolor. So right now, most of this is pretty dry. So if I wanted to add in more detail into these clouds and add levels and layers and things like that, I could. If you want to do that, you can try that if you have time. Otherwise, the last thing I was going to do is maybe do just a few of these wispy clouds that are kind of more a drier look. So I'm going to add some paint here. They're purpley blue again. And there's a tiny bit of brown in them, it looks like. I'm going to dab my brush off a little bit on this paper towel to make it not so wet. And then I'm going to just try and scrape. It's still a little wet. There we get some of the paper coming through, the texture of the paper. See the difference here where it was kind of too wet and it looks like a blob, where down here it looks, you can see the texture of the paper, kind of looks like what Turner was doing there. Just kind of feels wispy, like a stormy sky. Okay, well that's our quick tutorial today. I hope you enjoyed this and enjoy your art time. Thanks.